This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you today from the beautiful mountains of North Carolina in our studio in Hendersonville, North Carolina. My guest today is Dr. Ryan Burge, whose book, I have a copy of it right here, The Nuns, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They Are Going. It's received a lot of attention, a lot of commentary. I spoke with him recently, and I'm going to have that conversation for you in just a few minutes. As always, I have the news, 5 stories plus a personal word, and then after that, my commentary. Some of you know that I'm a great fan of Jerry Seinfeld. Many of you are as well. You watch his stuff every day, perhaps like I do. One of his most famous shows, or I should say, one of the most famous lines to come out of those 9 years of comedy was the line from the Soup Nazi, "No soup for you." Well, I've used it as the title of my commentary this week, and you'll understand why when we get to that part of the program. But first, I want the news. I want to give you the news brought to you by PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. Order your coffee from Perfecto Coffee Inc. I've got a bag of it here in my studio, and I promote it and I give it away to all of my guests. So here's the news. We begin in Washington, D.C. The bishops and archbishops of the Roman Catholic Church have gathered in Washington, D.C., as we all have been following this story, to debate and draft a document directing how priests should handle public figures who support policies at odds with the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, what they should do with these public figures when they come to Mass. Some people think they should not be served the elements of the Eucharist. The specific issue is how to receive these public figures, whether to serve them the Eucharist. It's been on the front page of most of the newspapers because 2 very famous and influential Americans, our President Joe Biden and the Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, are both very active and practicing Catholics. I'll keep you posted on the developments there. A little to the north in Philadelphia, the Supreme Court took up a Philadelphia case. It's called Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia. It's about discrimination, religion, and sexual orientation. The question was whether the City of Philadelphia, in its non-discrimination policy, could work with Catholic Charities of Philadelphia in placing children for foster care and adoption. The court ruled 9-0 in favor of the Catholic Charities. It's the latest in a long string of unanimous decisions. I think trying to send a signal that maybe the court is not nearly as divided as the nation is. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, quote, "So long as the government can achieve its interest in a manner that does not burden religion, it must do so." Going south to Jackson, Mississippi, in a case with very similar dynamics as the Supreme Court ruling in Philadelphia, atheist groups and individuals in Mississippi have filed a complaint in federal court asking for relief from state policy forcing them to purchase vehicle license plate that carry the seal of the state with its motto, "In God We Trust." You can see it there in very much enlarged on the screen. The seal was recently changed to include that phrase. That's part of a nationwide effort by conservative groups to insert religious and Christian language into public and official documents. In their filing, interestingly enough, the plaintiffs cite this Supreme Court decision, Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia. and its directive to governments to accommodate religion or non-religion as they are able. Moving north a little bit to Nashville, Tennessee, Ben Zobrist, a retired Major League Baseball player, filed a civil lawsuit against his former pastor and friend. He accused him of having an affair with his wife, while at the same time requesting large donations from him to support various ministry projects. Ben is the son of an Illinois pastor. He attended Christian universities and then played Major League Baseball until 2019 for Tampa Bay, Kansas City, and the Chicago Cubs. He was named, some of you will remember, the most valuable player in the 2016 World Series when he helped Chicago win the World Series, I believe the first time in 108 years. It was considered kind of a curse. The defendant, Brian Yawn, now a Nashville businessman, he was formerly a pastor, the pastor of Community Bible Church in Nashville. Ben Zobrist's wife, Juliana, is a Christian musician. They co-authored the 2014 book, Double Play, about faith and family. The couple has 3 children. They are in divorce proceedings. Also in Nashville, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution calling for a permanent ban from ministry for those convicted of sexual abuse. I was there, I heard it. The measure was debated. There was resistance from the floor, from those contending that God forgives and transforms many people with awful sins, and they cited Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle. The resolution follows research from the Southern Baptist Convention's Lifeway research team, showing that a strong majority of Protestant pastors support such a ban. Sexual abuse has been a long-standing problem in Roman Catholic circles and a more recent issue among evangelicals such as Southern Baptist. And finally, this personal note. In Evansville, Illinois, my sister-in-law, Raina Bodie Moody, passed away this morning at the age of 72. She was the wife of my only brother, David. They had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. She fought breast cancer for 6.5 years. She's been on hospice care for a little over 2 weeks. I'll be leaving North Carolina in a few days to drive out there to officiate at that funeral. We're going to call it the Celebration of Life. I ask you to pray for me as I travel and as I lead that service, and pray for my brother David and all of his family. It's a sad time. I'll be back in just a minute, though, with my pre-recorded interview with Ryan Burge. Stay tuned.
Culture to get out here. This is my wife. Would you welcome Fiona Whelan Bryant? Tender kiss, always thinking how the skies are gray or blue. Any place on earth will do, just as long as I'm with you. My happiness. A million years it seems have gone by since we shared our dreams. But I'll hold you again. There'll be no blue memories then, where the skies are gray or blue. Any place on earth will do, and just as long as I'm with you, my happiness. And just as long as I'm with you, my happiness. We're trying.
This is the Meeting House. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. With me in the Meeting House today is Dr. Ryan Burge. We're going to talk about his book. Dr. Burge is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois, but he's also assistant professor at Eastern Illinois University with a PhD in political science and a specialty in religious life in America, which is exactly the theme of our own show here. Ryan, this is your new book. Tell us in just a few words, who are the nuns, spelled N-O-N-E-S? Who are they?
So it's three different groups of people. It's people who on a survey say they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Combined, those three groups make up about 30% of the population, which is up significantly from where they were just 10 years ago. I mean, in the 1970s, they were only 5% of America, and now they're 30% of America. They're the fastest growing religious group in America today.
There are so many questions that come to my mind as I read your book, as I listened to you talk, but I want to help our listeners first. I had to get educated as I read your book. Tell us the sources from which you get your data.
Yeah, so two different surveys I use in the book and I use extensively in my work. One is called the General Social Survey, which has been done basically biannually since 1972. It's considered to be the gold standard sociological survey in amongst folks who do what I do. The other is what's called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which began in 2006. And the data for that, the 2020 wave, just came out last Friday. It's the benefit of that survey is it's a lot larger. The GSS is around 2,000 people per year. The CCS was 61,000 people last year. So we get a lot more specificity in those bigger samples.
Now, in questioning like this, do they question people through social media or the phone or face-to-face or what? How do they gather this information?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The General Social Survey is done face-to-face, or it was until 2020 came around. And then they switched it. But traditionally, 46 years worth, it's been done in a face-to-face sort of very traditional survey style where you actually, know the person asking you questions. They hand you pieces of paper and, for response options, things like that. The CCES is all done online, though. And that's the move that most every polling house has made over the last couple of years, realizing that online, as internet access has become more widespread and been adopted by people of every age range, every income bracket, it's become much easier, cheaper, and better. The data is actually better now doing online surveys than doing face-to-face or phone surveys. And so people are on panels. So you get recruited to be on a panel. And then if you're on a panel and they're looking for someone that you meet the description of, then they'll contact you to do a survey and you get paid a small amount to complete that survey. That's really how most surveys are being done today.
So if I sign up to do one of these, that is to help administer the survey,
Mm-hmm.
do they give me a certain region to cover or names that I'm supposed to call, or am I just supposed to find my own people?
No, so the administrators are all trained social scientists, right? So
Right.
it's not just a volunteer, but to be the person being asked the question. So they have what are called stables of panelists that they have like 100,000 people in a stable, let's say, and they'll say, okay, we need to have 500 women and 500 men for our survey. So they'll randomly draw out of those 100,000 people, 500 women and 500 men, knowing that those people are responsive to surveys and will take that survey and get paid for it. So that's really the way that it used to be what's called random digit dialing, which is basically they would just have the phone call a random phone number, which worked really well until people got cell phones and stopped answering the phone. And so now like response rates for phone surveys are around 2%.
Right.
So you got to think to get one response, you have to do 50 phone calls. To do 1,000 person survey, it takes 50,000 phone calls. So like that whole thing becomes so inefficient. The problem is too, who answers the phone anymore? It's typically not a random sample of America like it used to be. So that's why we moved to those online panel designs. And almost every survey now is using that online panel style because it's cheaper. And the data quality is actually better using those new styles than the old style now, at least.
So it's coming through social media. You mean like an email?
Yeah, so they'll recruit you saying, would you like to be on, let's say, a panel for the Qualtrics is the company that I use a lot.
And
so,
by the word panel, you mean a group of people who are going to answer the questions.
Or potentially could be contacted in the future to answer questions.
I see, right.
Right. So then they basically have a list. It's like they have a Rolodex of people who can take your survey. And that way they don't have to go randomly out searching for people. So they're constantly recruiting for these panels. And then if you're on a panel, you might get contacted for a survey. You might not, just depends on what they're looking for. But it just makes it easier to narrow everything down.
And you think this gives a representative slice? There are a lot of people who would never want to be on a panel and never want to talk to anybody. There are still a lot of people that don't have access to social media things.
Mm-hmm.
You think even with these large groups of people, they're still getting a good sample?
Yeah. So Pew's actually done work on this where they compared doing it the old way, which is the phone calls, to the new way, which is the online panels. And they actually find that the online panels are actually more accurate than the phone calls. And Pew, which is sort of the gold standard of survey firms in America today, does almost all their polling now using their online panel setup. And they've done this with deliberation over a long period of time. This hasn't been something you just decide to put the switch on, because like we talked about, the problem is to do it the old way with phone calls, you might get 2% response rate, but what happens if it's only men or only women or only older people or only white people or only educated people, right? So even then doing it the old way actually biases it more now than it did 30 years ago. So sticking with the old method is actually worse given the circumstances that we're in, that no one answers their phone anymore.
Now, let me go back to Gallup and ask you this question. I reported that Gallup has issued this report about church membership. Do they have their own independent data, or are they using the same data that these other groups are using?
No, Gallup has their own independent data. That George Gallup was really the first pollster in America. That's kind of his claim to fame. Started doing it in 1936, did the first poll ever in the country. And so they have most of these survey firms like Pew, like Gallup, like Barna, if you're into the evangelical pollster, they all have what are called proprietary data, which means they collect it all on their own. They keep it on their own servers. They don't share it with the general public. They just share the findings. They don't actually share the raw survey data with hardly anyone, because that's sort of like their currency. Data has become money in the 21st century. Right. So, having a collection of survey data that no one else has really puts you in a very unique spot. So, no, Gallup has been asking these questions and keeping the data themselves for 70 years now.
Do they sell their data, Gallup?
No, there's no real reason. I don't think they ever would find a reason to do that, because then it's sort of they lose their niche of the market, right? Which is data from 1940s. Like literally no one has religion data from the 1940s except Gallup. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. So they really have the market corner there.
Let's go back to this notion of the nuns. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in the NONES. Now, I have 3 children. Like many people their age, my children grew up in church, morning, noon, and night. I was a pastor, of course, but now they are only casually connected to the church. All of them would be still formally the member of some church. they would identify as Christian but not connected to a congregation. Do they qualify as a nun?
That's a good question. It comes down to, if they were asked on a survey, what's your present religion of any? If they said no religion, then they would be a nun.
But if they said Christian,
they would not be a nun. Nope, they would be a Christian.
And is there a way on any of these surveys do you all track the people who say they are Christian but are not connected with any organization, church, mosque, temple, whatever?
We do ask if they attend or their frequency of attendance.
Yeah.
Right. So that kind of helps connect people. But we know that, so if you think about, we think about religion in three ways. There's three sort of dimensions to religiosity. There's religious belonging, which is what we talked about. What's your present religion, if any, right? So that's like, what social group are you a part of?
Right.
There's religious behavior, which is almost always measured through church attendance. How often do you attend church outside of weddings and funerals? And then the third one is called belief, which is, what do you believe about God? And then, do you believe in God without any doubts, or do you not believe in God at all? And there's sort of a range of options you're given there. What we know is that most people, the first thing to go for most people is the religious behavior piece. They stop going to church before they stop doing anything else. About 35-40% of Americans never go. And then the second thing to go is religious belonging, which is the thing where you say you have no religious affiliation. And then the last of the three, the one that kind of is the most stubborn, I guess you could say, is religious belief. And that only about 11% of Americans, even today, say they have an atheist or agnostic belief in God. So, 90% of Americans still have a belief in God, despite the fact that 40% of them never go to church and 25% say they have no religious affiliation.
I want to go back to your definition of behavior.
Yeah.
As a theologian, I distinguish between behavior as something that people do after they leave church and practice. That is, the things that Christians or Muslims or any religious group does when they gather. So singing, for instance, or receiving an offering would be a Christian practice, something that they do collectively in a worship service, as we will Sunday on Easter. But behavior, things like telling the truth or keeping promises or refraining from stealing, the things that are governed by, let's say, the 10 Commandments, these are things people do in their wider social life. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, I guess from a social science perspective, we're more interested in attendance because attendance leads to exposure to ideas and people, right? So, if you are, like, let's say you're attending an evangelical church, the more you attend, the more exposure you're going to get to evangelical theology or conservative political ideology, being in one of those churches. So we're interested in attendance becomes a proxy for how attached you are to that thing, right? So let's say you're Catholic, but you go to church once a year. That's something different than being Catholic and going to church, going to mass 3 or 4 times a week. We think that you're probably going to be more attached to the Catholic tradition the more often you go. So we use attendance as sort of a proxy for, intensity of that attachment that you have.
Yes, but you can see the point I'm trying to make, that one of the purposes of all religions is to shape how people actually live, not what they do in the sanctuary, but what they do when they leave the sanctuary. And let's just say I had an interview some months ago with a recent convert to Catholicism, and she talks about the hard rules of Catholicism, and we talked about one in particular, not using contraception as one of the rules of behavior. That's something that is intended to define a Catholic, although it's something that doesn't happen in the sanctuary. And so the question becomes, is attending a mass and hearing a homily more constitutive of Catholicism, or is refraining from the use of contraception or telling the truth or any of these other things that isn't designed to shape behavior, shape the way we actually live life.
Mm.
That's the distinction I'm trying to make. And I know it doesn't fit. I want to go back to something you talk about in your book, and you just alluded to a minute ago. You trace the change from the slow growth of the nuns to dramatic growth of the nuns to something that happened in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to describe that, talk about it, and let's talk about what was it that happened in America that created what you all call the hockey stick line.
Yeah. So that's a good description. The hockey stick is, if you see the graph, it's just flat from 1972 to about 1990 or so. And then it just, boom, shoots up into the right, in a pretty steep incline from that point forward. The nuns only grew 2% in 20 years from 1972 to 1990, basically. So really slow growth and then really quick growth from that point forward. They're growing 1 or 2% every year from that point forward, And really, I think there was a confluence of events that happened in America in the early 1990s that it's sort of easy to overlook if you weren't really a student of history. And so in 1990, for instance, the Summer of Mercy happened, which was this sort of nationwide movement, anti-abortion movement in this country. Anti-abortion is a modern political movement. In the 1970s, even the Southern Baptists were fairly moderate on the issue of abortion. Right. It sort of got activated by the Catholic Church. And there's plenty of evidence now from historians who say that evangelicals basically co-opted that piece of Catholic theology and sort of adopted it as their own in terms of pro-life views. Right. So that really kicked off a lot of changes in America. So in 1994, we had the Contract with America and Newt Gingrich, who, most political historians say he defined a new era in American politics, which was much more bruising and oppositional and critical of the other side. It used to be politicians basically got along. They had different policies, but they didn't hate each other. And Newt Gingrich was much more like he was willing to make enemies of the other side to get his agenda passed. And he was very successful at that. 1994, the Contract with America, Republicans took over the House, won 75 seats in the midterms. And the other thing that was going on in 1993, evangelicalism hit its peak in America at 30% of the population was evangelical. It's only 22% today. So even religion became more intense in the early 1990s. And if you think about it, that's right before the internet really became mainstream. Right. So televangelism really hit its peak influence in America in the late 80s and early 90s. So you had guys like Jim Bakker, guys like Jerry Falwell, guys like Pat Robertson, who were sort of all consumed with this, right-wing sort of theology and right-wing conservative political ideology. And I think what happened was a lot of moderate Christians who could hang out and be comfortable in a lot of denominations before that now were, faced with a lot of pro-life messaging and a lot of pro-Republican messaging. And that drove, I think, a lot of moderate Protestants out of these churches and into the arms of the nuns during that early 1990s period. And then it just built on itself. The more people that became nuns, it became easier for the next wave to become nuns. And now it just continued, that graph has just accelerated in the last 20 years.
One of the most interesting statistics in your book, you say that in 1972, half of the practicing Christians who were attending church were Democrats. Mm-hmm. And today, only 25% of practicing Christians are Democrats. Mm-hmm. Well, I think the scenario that you have just described has really pushed a lot of more progressive and moderate people out of the church. Is that what you're contending?
Yeah, and I think that's actually what you see in the data, because the group that's really seen the biggest decline is what are called mainline Protestants. And those are people like United Methodists, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, American Baptists, which is what I am. They were 30% of America in 1976. And today they're 10% of America. I mean, that's 1 in 5 Americans are not mainline Protestant anymore. And I think for a lot of them, they felt like, I can handle this church when it was just what we were doing, but now I'm getting painted as being a Falwell, being a Robertson, being this far right, which I don't really believe anyway. And by the way, a lot of them didn't believe it in the first place. They were not really attached to religion in the first place. It just kind of nudged them out over time, especially if politics became more bruising and more polarized. It just became easier to walk away from Christianity because you feel like Christianity didn't speak for moderates or liberals, political liberals anymore. And the nuns did.
Yes. and of course, you and I both grew up as Southern Baptists. We both have left it for more progressive Baptist networks. I'm in the Cooperative Baptist. You're in the American Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that I am around are people who are coming out of the evangelical world, either into a progressive or what we might call a mainline tradition, or they're just leaving organized religion entirely.
Mm-hmm.
But much of it is with this kind of confession. Well, if that's what it means to be a Christian, that is this culture war, Jerry Falwell, moral majority, March attack on the Capitol. If that's what it means to be a Christian, count me out.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear this a lot. I had breakfast with a good friend, a minister, and he was on the verge of that himself just this week. And so I do think that all this politicalization, sometimes I think, you talked about Newt Gingrich and his willingness to see a political opponent as an enemy, that this comes out of the vocabulary that was introduced into the evangelical world principally by Jerry Falwell when he launched what was called the culture war. I don't know who came up with that phrase, but when you begin to frame everything as a war and use battle language, then your opponent becomes not just another citizen who has a different opinion, but they become the enemy that needs to be destroyed. And I feel like that has characterized so much of my adult life, not only in the denomination, the Southern Baptists, where they were out to destroy anybody who deviated, but in the Christian world at large, and now even in the political world at large. Does that make sense?
No, I think politicians have made it worse, though, right? Because they'll say things like, this is the most important election in the history of the republic, and if the other side wins, it'll be the end of America.
Yes.
I mean, that's what they said when Barack Obama won. And, we survived 8 years of Barack Obama. When Donald Trump won, we survived 4 years of Donald Trump, barely, but we survived. I mean, the republic is resilient, right? And these messages the thing is, it's people forget the fact that Republicans and Democrats used to be they just had differences in policy. They didn't hate each other. And now it's almost like we've demonized the other side in such a way that they're not just different, they're evil. And I think that is so
agree with you.
Caustic. It's just caustic to American discourse, and it's polarizing everything that we do. And unfortunately, the polarization makes everything worse because now we don't dialogue with people from the other side, so we don't see them as human beings. We depersonalize them and have created these sort of straw men out of the opposite side and not understanding who they really are.
And of course, the legislative sign of this is for the parties in Congress not to cooperate and compromise on legislation, but for each group to refuse to even vote for anything that comes up from the other party. And the Democrats feel like they have to have the majority vote with no Republicans. The Republicans feel like they have to have 100% of the Republicans and no Democrats so there's no collaboration even there.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's party discipline is all. You can't be a traitor to your party, right? We got you elected for a reason, so don't cross the aisle. It's like, for instance, universal background checks are supported by basically everybody. Like even 75% of white evangelical Republicans support universal background checks for gun purchases in this country. Yet that bill would not pass Congress right now. Things like a pathway to citizenship, like the DREAM Act, is actually incredibly popular amongst basically everyone. There are policies that could pass right now that the American public would like. It's just for some odd reason, people in Washington feel like they can't vote with the other party because it makes them a traitor, makes them, you can't be a compromiser now.
I want to step back for a minute and get a wide angle lens on this church attendance, church participation issue.
Yeah.
You have tracked in your book, The Nuns, the decline of religious affiliation and religious participation. But is it not true that this is happening across the board in many not just religious organizations, but many other kinds of health clubs, political parties, travel clubs, or, I'm thinking here about the famous book 20 years ago that you talked about in your book, Bowling Alone, where sports, even attendance at sporting events, high school sporting events, is on the decline.
Yeah.
Is this right?
Yeah, so there's some pretty compelling evidence that Americans are just less social creatures today than we were 20 or 30 years ago. And, the book that I talk about is called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, which is probably the best-selling political science book ever written. The subtitle is The Collapse and Revival of American Community, and it came out in the 90s. And what's funny is Putnam lays the blame for that decline in social capital on cable television, because that's when the book came out. It came out in the 90s when cable TV was really, proliferating across this country. But I think if Putnam was going to write version 2, it would be tweeting alone or Facebooking alone or Netflixing alone, or, whatever cable was, the internet has made that 10 times more exaggerated now. So it used to be you had to leave your house to socialize. You had to leave your house to be entertained, because you only had so limited options in your house to be entertained, because you only had 3 channels. You only had the radio or whatever it was. Now we literally have millions of ways to keep us entertained. So it's just easier to stay at home and not go out. And church used to be, and still is in some ways, resistant to that trend. But I think it can't be resistant all the way, right? It can't continue to fight against this wave of desocialization in America. I think a lot of what church has suffered from is just, it's another social organization. And so people are just doing less social stuff. And church has been, kind of swept up with the Moose Club and the Elks and the VFW Hall and all the social organizations that used to exist. People just don't do any of that anymore.
Well, I want to push back on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a social scientist with my finger on all the data, but I wonder if one of the issues is not that people are doing less socializing, but that the socializing that we're doing is spread across many more kinds of things. When I was growing up, there were just very few things you could do as a kid. You could play in the band, and you could join the sports leagues at school, or you were going to church, Boy Scouts, maybe another. But now there are so many, I think about Comic-Con, things like this that did not even exist. Well, I don't even know where it got started, but I'd never heard of it. Mm-hmm. There's so many, there are these extreme sports, which there are travel things there, and some of them are online and some of them are not. Is it really true that we're less social, or is our social activity just spread out across more things?
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting idea. For instance, I grew up playing video games. Nintendo and Sega and all those things were sort of getting big whenever I was a kid. So I played a lot of video games, but I sat in my room and played those video games by myself, right? Very socially isolated activity. My kids play video games that are all online now with their friends. Right? My
grandson plays chess every day online. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Has through the whole pandemic. And does this count as socializing?
So the evidence right now says that it is not equivalent one-to-one. Socializing online does not equal socializing in person.
Right.
And I think we all recognize that after COVID, right, after lockdowns and doing everything via Zoom, that Zoom meetings are a lot more draining emotionally than meeting someone in person, it feels like, right? There's something about this that depersonalizes the whole thing. And things like, even like on a Zoom meeting, you can't have like side conversation, right? You can't have like little banter before and after the meeting. It just seems so awkward and so forced. So, there's evidence that it's better than nothing, but it's surely not as good as the real authentic one-to-one thing.
Okay, so I'm going to push back on this.
Yeah.
I attend an online Sunday school class, out of a church in Asheville, North Carolina. It starts at 9:45, but the Zoom starts 20 to 30 minutes earlier so people will have time to socialize. Uh-huh. Second, we always use a chat bar so people can either communicate individually or with one another. And I'll have to confess here, I don't know whether other people do this or not, but the whole time I'm in my Sunday school class, I am texting with another member of the class. Uh-huh. So which is a level of communication. It's like the modern version of whispering, turning over to the person next to you around the circle and whispering while the teacher's trying to teach. Well, I'm sitting here texting, giving some ideas or commentaries or reaction to the teacher. I find this, boy, this is a very compelling social engagement, and evidently because millions of people all over the country are doing this.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to stick though. I mean, I do speaking events. I used to do more speaking events, obviously, before COVID locked us down. And I think everybody I've talked to in terms of booking me to come do things, let's say like in October, November of this year,
right,
always is saying, we want you, if you are comfortable, to come in person.
Sure.
There's definitely, I think most event coordinators are saying, if we can make it happen in person, we will do it in person, because we realize the thing about the Zoom thing is, like, I teach, I'm still a professor, so I teach. I'm not teaching right now, but I taught in the fall, and I would teach a class online with 25 students, and I would look at a screen of black squares because they would all turn their cameras off. So I don't know what in the world they were even doing on the other side of the camera. They might have been playing video games or talking to their friends, or, in the other room, and I wouldn't even know it. And let me tell you, teaching to a screen of black squares is probably one of the most demoralizing experiences of my life.
I can understand that. I'm surprised you couldn't require them to show their face.
But can't, because what if they have kids at home? What if they're in a public place? There's all these requirements. Like, what if they had to go work? There's all these things that we have to be very, the thing about COVID for us was our whole approach was to be graceful and flexible with them and their circumstances. Right? Understanding that they have all kinds of different needs at home. And so to require them to turn their cameras on is sort of to maybe expose people who don't want to be exposed. Maybe they live in a bad condition, right? Maybe they live in a hostile environment. So, it gets really complicated when
I understand. I understand. Yeah. Well, I'll have to confess that I'm getting ready to start an online Bible class. As a matter of fact, on April the 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Central Time, your time, I am going to pull together the first 20 interested people to talk about starting a Zoom class, Dr. Moody's Bible class. So you're telling me that maybe I've missed the wave of this, and I'm a year or two behind.
You know what, though? I think there's a small group of people who really do, express your opinion, which is they really like the Zoom approach. And I do think you're going to have more success, because if they opt in, listen, nobody opts into taking my class. They take it because they want to get a degree.
Oh, that's not true. They probably stand in line, have to get up early, like getting tickets to a Kentucky ball game.
I wish that was the case, but a lot of them
camp out. Come on, Ryan.
Well, yeah, but no, like some of them, I will say some of them are there because they want to have a class with me, but a lot of them are there just because they want to get through college, right? So, having an all volunteer situation, I think, would get a lot more uptick, like a lot more people turning their cameras on and doing the right thing. But I think the reality is, if I'll never have to teach on Zoom again, will be a great day. I told people, I go, if this is what we're going to do going forward, like we're going to teach on Zoom as our careers, I will quit and go do something else, because it's just so soul crushing for me.
Well, I've interviewed a lot of pastors over the last year through the pandemic, and there's a lot of anxiety from ministers on the other side of what you're talking about. I'm sure business people feel the same way. They're not sure people are going to come back. They've gotten used to watching the church service in their pajamas, or ordering from Amazon. But you seem to think people are ready to get out and come back and see people face to face and shake hands.
So, Mike, I think our experience at my church is sort of instructive of what we have to look forward to. And that is we started going back in person about a month ago. My church is about 15 people, and they're all old, like 75 years and up.
That's not old. That's not nearly as old as you think it is, Ryan. Be careful. I just had my 71st birthday like 2 days ago. So,
I got several 90-year-olds in my congregation. And by any stretch, that is old.
That is old. Yeah, I guess
old.
It is.
You can't get away from that. But what's interesting was when we came back, there were 11 of us the first day. And we had a couple people who were good, faithful attenders before, but weren't back. And so I asked, of the 11 that were there, myself being one of them, how many had been vaccinated? And 9 out of 11 had been vaccinated. I hadn't, because I wasn't eligible. And now I am vaccinated, by the way. So we've had Sundays now where we've had 10 or 12 people, and all but one of us have been vaccinated. And now we're getting some of the reluctant people who had already been vaccinated, but were just reluctant to go back into crowds, are coming back too. So I think it's going to be a slow climb. You know, a lot of people came rushing back because they really wanted to be back. But I think other people who had, like, let's say, medical problems, let's say a history of cancer, things like that, were going to be more reluctant and need more reassurance that things are going to be better. So I don't think we're going to get back to like that pre-pandemic level of attendance, maybe ever. But it's certainly not going to be in the next month or two. It's going to be, you know, let's say, you know, September, October, when the pandemic largely is behind us.
Well, it not only is today Maundy Thursday and the beginning of all of this series of gatherings for Christians, it's also, I believe, the opening day of baseball.
Amen.
And so it's not just church people and church leaders who are going to watch very carefully how eager people are to congregate. It's the baseball owners and the people who run golf clubs and all sorts of civic organizations. So it's going to be interesting to see how the world comes out of this pandemic. Ryan, it's been great talking to you. This is such a fascinating subject about the American religious landscape. I'm very interested in it. I've had several shows on it. I've, of course, read your book and reviewed it. People can read my review online at themeetinghouse.net, where you can go and sign up for my newsletter each week. I send it out at 8:30 each Wednesday evening. That's Eastern Standard Time. And my recent newsletter does contain my review of this wonderful little book. This is the kind of book that church reading groups and Sunday school classes would be wise to pick up and read. Thank you, Ryan. You'll have to come back sometime in the Meeting House, and we'll talk about more of this research that you are involved in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dwight. I really appreciate it.
I spent 15 years in the Marine Corps and enjoyed every minute of it. In fact, I wanted to retire at the end of 30. However, due to several injuries, it was time that I retired. So here I am doing this now, but my time in the Marine Corps really embodied me and made me into what I am today. Hi, my name is Bruce Long. I'm the CEO and founder of Perfecto Coffee. I was a military policeman, an MP in the Marine Corps, and oftentimes we would stop and get coffee, whether that was at a on-base location or off-base, drive-through or whatnot. Coffee was something that was essential to the whole platoon, and it was during that time I really started to focus a lot more on coffee because I didn't want to do so many energy drinks. Energy drinks were really big and still are. So I wanted to do something about that, and I started Perfecto Coffee. Perfecto Coffee is a company that was basically designed to bring gourmet coffee much closer to the consumer. We wanted to utilize locally sourced beans that are fresh. And that's one of the key components to Perfecto, the bean itself being fresh. You know, as far as our other ingredients, we all get those locally, giving back to those that give to us. I wanted to make sure that quality of taste was one of the pillars that we posted Perfecto Coffee on top of, as far as accessibility as well and affordability. Those three things were very important to us, and consistency as well. And that's really what Perfecto Coffee is. It's consistent, it's affordable, it's accessible, and it's great tasting coffee.
Thank you, Bruce, for all your hard work and all that you do for us and your family, and as well as our community. We really appreciate you and what you do for us.
My dad makes the best coffee. My dad is a great dad. He always thinks about things and how they should be, and he's great at being an inventor, and he's just very smart and a great dad.
I have the best dad ever. He's nice, he treats me with respect, and he cares about people, and that's what a good dad does.
You know, I would like to say if there's any veterans out there that, I don't know everything, but if I can help them out in any way, please feel free to send me an email, contact me, call me, and I'll do anything I can. And if I can't help them, I'll point them in the right direction in which they can,
Perfect.
Yeah?
Right.
Okay.
Good job.
Oh.
I recorded it.
Oh. I was getting ready to say it. Good to go.
And I'll drop that right in here.
Ministerial journey. I was in a flippant mood that day and I responded, Jesus, Jack, Jerry, and John. I had to explain what I meant, and I better explain it to you. Jesus, our Lord and Savior, yes. British scholar and writer C.S. Lewis, known to his friends as Jack. Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian. And in recent years, John Prine, the singer and songwriter. Jesus, Jack, Jerry, and John. Which explains why the current hubbub in the Roman Catholic Church about who can and cannot be served communion made me think of the soup Nazi. For those indifferent to the first-rate comedy, the soup Nazi is a character in several of Seinfeld episodes. They date from the 1990s. The soup Nazi runs a popular soup kitchen in New York City, but is known for his strict protocols of how to order and how to pay for the cup of soup. Jerry, of course, obeys the rules and he gets his soup, but George and Elaine run afoul of the frowning proprietor and thus hear the now famous judgment, no soup for you. You could go on YouTube and search those words and the episode will come up. It's very funny. Catholics and a few other Christian groups like some Baptists already use that phrase for a wide swath of believing people, like me, perhaps like you. I attend Mass occasionally, and when I do, I obey the Roman Catholic rules. I take my place in line. I fold my arms across my chest. I approach the priest, serving the elements. I'm sending him a signal, the designated signal that I am not a Catholic, and thus am requesting a blessing rather than communion. The priest obliges, of course. He sets the wafer and the cup aside, and he gives me a blessing using the sign of the cross and a few spoken words. It's not just non-believers and non-Catholics who are subject to this no bread for you treatment. Several categories of baptized Catholics are also excluded, like those who are divorced and civilly remarried. Persons, that is, those who have unconfessed grave sins, that is, they haven't been to confession. And then we might add this category, people who fail to embrace Catholic teaching on a wide range of moral issues, such as euthanasia, care for the poor and sick, welcoming the stranger, and promoting abortion. All of this is laid out in what Catholics call canon law, especially sections 912, 915, and 916. Some contend, in their commentaries on these things, that a non-compliant Catholic represents not a failure on the part of the person, and thus in need of judgment, but a failure on the part of the institution, the church. That is, the church has failed to teach in a compelling and convincing way the standards of Christian morality. All these rules aside, I have my own thoughts on the matter. I don't like being a second-class Christian when I attend Mass. I don't like being publicly segregated from the people at worship. I do my best to participate, kneeling, singing, greeting, listening, praying, reading. But when it comes to the epicenter of the Catholic worship service, the Eucharist, I am excluded for no good reason. I've been a practicing Christian all my life. I was baptized at the age of 9 and ordained to gospel work at the age of 27. I have served what we call the Lord's Supper or communion, or what Catholics call the Eucharist, hundreds of times. Not that I'm perfect. As a person, a pastor, or even a believer, like everyone else who enters the sanctuary and kneels in prayer, I am a sinner saved by grace. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's what the Word of God says. Frankly, I'm not so enamored of this ritual anyway. Regardless of where it's performed and how, whether it's in a Mass in a Catholic church or the Lord's Supper at the close of the worship service in a Baptist church. What captivated my imagination many years ago was the fellowship supper, where we are all welcome and there are no exclusions. This gathering around a table to eat a common meal, known in the Bible as the agape feast, is precisely what Jesus did throughout his ministry. Quote, he ate with sinners. That's the way the gospel records it. And that's the way his critics stated it as well. And you know he did. Everywhere he went, he ate with people. My favorite Jesus story is of the day he was passing through Jericho. He saw that wee little man in a sycamore tree. He called him by name. Zacchaeus, come down from the tree. I want to go to your house for dinner. That's exactly what happened. And while eating, Jesus must have spoken about the gospel, the kingdom of God, the call to confession, the gift of conversion, because, the gospel tells us, at the end of the meal, Zacchaeus stood up and announced he was changing. I'm going in a new direction, he said. I'm going to give away half of my wealth to the poor, and I'm going to reimburse anyone that I've cheated 4 times over. You know what Jesus said? Today, salvation has come to this house. This is the kind of meal I prefer, not in the sanctuary, but in the fellowship hall. Or maybe in your home or mine. The kind of gathering that's open to everyone, saint and sinner, pilgrim and stranger, young and old, the committed and the curious. It's the sort of spiritual and social event where never is heard a discouraging word, especially that awful phrase, no soup for you. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute. You're in the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody. Last week, as you know, I was in Nashville, Tennessee for the meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. This is one last look I want to give on my experience over there. It's been 31 years since I attended a Southern Baptist Convention, and it may be another 31 before I go again. But in my reflections upon my experience there, I'm reminded of the famous quote attributed to Mark Twain. He said it to a British journalist who had said he'd heard a rumor about his death, and Mark Twain famously reported, quote, "The report of my death is an exaggeration," end quote. The same can be said about the Southern Baptist Convention. It's still alive and flexing its ecclesial and cultural muscle. Yes, it has lost a lot of members, 2.3 million in the last 15 years. But it could lose that many more and still be the largest Protestant group in the United States. Is there a decline? Yes. Not only in numbers and baptisms and churches, but the loss of some pretty significant people like Ralph West, the influential Black Baptist pastor in Houston, Beth Moore, the influential Bible teacher also from Houston, and Russell Moore, a first-rate theological mind. We may end up adding the name of Rick Warren. You know, he's the founder and the pastor of the famed Saddleback Church out in California. Southern Baptist appointed a committee to, quote, investigate his ordination of 3 women to the gospel ministry. Who knows where that will lead? We'll certainly keep you posted on that. But one thing is not a mystery. Southern Baptists are not a moderate group, and their new president, Ed Litton, is not a moderate Baptist, regardless of what a New York Times headline asserted. Southern Baptists like to be known as conservative, but they regularly act like outright fundamentalists. And I would argue that the recent annual meeting of the denomination confirmed the perception that their classification into categories like fundamentalist is very much like that used in the National Basketball Association. There, they use flagrant 1 and flagrant 2 to describe unacceptable behavior. Here's the difference. In the NBA, a flagrant 2 foul gets a player ejected from the game. And in the Southern Baptist Convention, though, a fundamentalist 2 reputation gets you on the ballot for president. You may not win the vote, as the election last week demonstrated. A kinder, gentler fundamentalist, what I would call a fundamentalist 1, won that election, but barely. And I suspect, and most people predict, that the fundamentalist 2 preacher, Mike Stone from Blackshear, Georgia, will be back next year to do battle for the soul of the denomination. He'll have a lot of support, especially from those like the man who stood up at a microphone last week and proposed that the wording of a resolution on pregnancy and abortion be changed. The original language called for Christians to, quote, love, care for, and minister to, end quote, women who came for help with an unwanted pregnancy. But he proposed that that pastoral language be stricken and in its place inserted a demand that the women, quote, repent of their sin, end quote. That's what I'm talking about. That effort to amend a proposed resolution so shows how difficult it will be for Southern Baptists to deal with their 2 big issues, race and gender. On the race issue, the new Southern Baptist president was clearly the best choice. He emphasizes grassroots congregational efforts at racial reconciliation. And he's not one of those who's part of the wide open attack on critical race theory. There was a great deal of heat generated on that latter subject called CRT, but precious little light. Goodness knows, Southern Baptists, above all people, need a come to Jesus conversion on matters of race. But can I throw in this hunch? One day, long after I'm dead, the Southern Baptist Convention will be largely a Black denomination. How about that? Why do I say that? Because there's been a dramatic increase in the number of Black Baptist churches affiliating with the Southern Baptist Convention. In multiracial churches and organizations, things go fine as long as the white folk are in charge, regardless of how many Black folk are in the pews. Research shows that once the face at the head of the table or behind the pulpit appears Black, the white folk leave. That may just be what happens in the SBC, and that may explain why a Black person has never been elected to lead an agency, an institution, or a mission board within the Southern Baptist Convention. You won't have to wait any longer to discern the grassroots irritation toward the establishment in the Southern Baptist Convention, like those people who run the agencies and the seminaries. Powerful and popular seminary president Al Mohler was a candidate for the SBC president, but he didn't even make the runoff. That was shocking. But the fivefold rebuke of the executive committee was even more stunning and surely unprecedented. I wrote about that last week. You can read it on the news at the meetinghouse.net. The executive director of that 90-member decision-making group needs to resign, I think, or retire. And finally, through all of the pre-convention and post-convention commentary, one big issue was ignored: Donald J. Trump. The former president cast a serious shadow over Southern Baptist, just as he does the Republican Party. And often there's serious question as to the difference between that denomination and that party. The long-term consequences of this connection, this marriage, may compare to the relationship Southern Baptists had with the Confederacy and the subsequent white supremacist culture of the South. And we all know that was not good. After 31 years away, 3 days in Nashville was enough for me. I'm glad I went, and I'll hold open the possibility of returning in another 31 years. I'm Dwight Moody, and I'll be back in just a minute with a few closing thoughts. You've been in the Meeting House today with me, your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from North Carolina this week. Who knows where I'll be next week? I've got to go to Illinois for the funeral, as I explained a little earlier. I encourage you to visit my website, themeetinghouse.net. There are lots of commentaries, podcasts, book reviews. You may find something you like that you'd like to pass along. Feel free to post these on your Facebook page, any of them that you find interesting. I encourage you to join our Circle of 70. These are the people who believe in what we're doing here and have made a contribution to support our work. You can be a part of that Circle of 70. We're trying to find 70 donors. I think we have 29 now. I encourage you to join us. Write a check or go online at themeetinghouse.net/support, and you can give through the website. We'll keep you posted on our fundraising. We have very modest goals. Our goal for the first 6 months of this year was just $20,000. And as a matter of fact, tonight our board meets to decide on what our budget's going to be for the next 6 months, and we'll keep you posted on that. You could also join my weekly Bible study. We meet by Zoom at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on Monday night. I think there are 29 registered people from 10 states, from all over the country, from 3 time zones, probably including your time zone. And we invite you to bring your Bible and join in this discussion of the Bible. Thank you for listening to us today, coming to you over the meetinghouse.net and rejoice975.com, which is 97.5 FM and 94.7 FM in Glenn County, Georgia. That's Brunswick, St. Simon's Island, Sea Island, and Jekyll Island, a beautiful part of the country. We're also broadcasting on SSC Live. That is St. Stephen's Church Ministry, Louisville, Kentucky, through their YouTube and Facebook Live networks. And some of you are watching there. I want to thank the engineer, Everett Armstrong, in the studio in the Golden Isles of Georgia, Alex Mattingly in Louisville. I want to thank all of you for listening, all of you who write me and post. If you would like to receive the weekly newsletter, it goes out on Wednesday night. You can write me, or you just go to the website and there's a place where you can sign up and subscribe. It's free. And much of the material that we use on the program here is also in the newsletter. You can follow me on Twitter, and I'm glad to report that after the Southern Baptist Convention stuff, I'm up to 416 followers on Twitter. I'm hardly shaking anything out there in Twitter land, but you can join me on Twitter. Until next week, I encourage you to be safe, do justice, love mercy. That's the prophetic word. I've gotten a vaccine. I hope you have as well. Drink some coffee. Order some Perfecto coffee at perfectocoffeeinc.com. Send a donation to the Meeting House. We need it. And pray for the soul of America. The country needs it. We all know that. We need to pray for a spirit of openness and camaraderie and concern and community in our nation. Be kind to everyone. Give thanks. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.